Do you ever wonder if trading queens is gonna be good or bad for your position? It's actually not that easy, but in this video I'm gonna teach you a few rules and give you a few examples so that you can make the right decision every time. I have a really interesting position to show you. Here we are playing with white, and we notice that we can play queen d5 forcing a queen trade. So the question for you is, should we trade the queens or not? I actually asked this question to several players around 1500, and the answers I got were really mixed. Some players told me that, white's king is safer, therefore there's no point in trading queens. Other players said, well, let's look at that pawn on d6. It is a backward pawn, isolated. We can put pressure on that pawn, and therefore trading queens could limit counterplay and make it easier to pursue that plan, attacking that pawn. In reality, this is a game that was played by one of our viewers, and white here played queen d5, which is actually a big mistake. Now let me show you how, and then I will explain to you how white should have played instead. Now let's start with the reasoning. The reason that queen d5 is not a good move is that after we trade and black plays king f7, the only real weakness that we had was that pawn on d6. It was an isolated backward pawn, but it is basically impossible to attack it anymore because we really only have one piece to attack it, the rook, and now black has two defenders, the rook and the king, that can go to e6 and effectively neutralize any threat we try to make. Now let me show you how the game continued because it's also instructive. Here the game continued with the king g2, king e6, rook d1, and d5. And it's already, I would say, not an unreasonable moment to just offer a draw and be done with the game. Or maybe just play king f3, king e3. But here white started to go in a slightly wrong direction with f4. Now, this is not entirely wrong. It's just a little bit weakening. It's like kind of exposing the position in an incorrect way. It would have been wiser to centralize the king. So here black played king d6, and perhaps they are thinking about going forward with the king, trying some kind of invasion. And now white played, I would say, the first clear mistake of this rook ending, which was c4. Now, you might ask why this move. I think that this is sometimes a psychological problem. White spent most of the game aiming against this backward pawn on d6. So sometimes people just struggle to switch gears and realize that that opportunity is gone. And the idea of trying to win this pawn is just not possible anymore. But I think here white was still trying to keep a little bit of pressure against that pawn by playing c4, but this is actually a weakening move. And now here black played king c5, and white is already a little bit struggling to figure out what's the right continuation. In fact, I would challenge you to try to think what's the right way to play with white in order not to be worse. Let me show you why this position is poisonous. First, let's say you take on d5, and then rook takes, and then let's just say that you decide to trade the rooks and go for a pawn ending. It turns out that this is lost. Now, we can calculate and see all the lines, but here's a simple rule of thumb that you can try to follow. After king f3, the position is lost because we can play king d4, and the pawn has reached the same rank as the pawn on f4. Now, you see the pawn on f4 is blocked by the pawn on f5. So the fact that I have reached this rank means that that pawn, one way or another, sooner or later, will be lost. And of course, there is a deeper problem, which is that I can actually go to the queen side, and the pawn on b2 is obviously lost as well. So just to be thorough, let's see how the game could have ended. Could have been, for example, king e2, king e4. You can't really go to d2 because I will go for this pawn on g3. So let's say you play king f2, I play king d3. And now I just expand on the queen side. It's very simple. b5, a5, b4, take, and effectively you can resign because next I'm going to play b3, king c2, take, and the game is just over. Now, let's go back a little bit. We were looking at the position after rook takes, right? And then in this position, white can still be clever and find a way to neutralize the problems by playing rook c1, good move. We're giving a check, and after king d6, then rook c2. So it is preventing this check. But I want you to notice that even in this position, black's king is better. Black's king is better than white's king, And then the rook is still threatening. You see a rook can go to d3 and it has a lot of good ideas. So after we play something like a5, this is still a very tricky position. And surprisingly enough, there is only one way for white to be okay here. Now, we are kind of going a little bit away from the main topic of the game, so I'm not going to dive into this too much. But let me just tell you that, roughly speaking, if you play a move like rook f2, I believe after something like rook d3 and then maybe king d5, you're going to be in serious trouble here. There's going to be pressure on g3 and pressure on b2. Too much. It will keep both the king and the rook restricted, so black might end up winning this. So the really brilliant way to kind of break free and neutralize all of these ideas is to play h4. Now, I know when you look at this, you might think, well, how could this possibly be a good idea, right? The point here is that if we make a move like rook d3, now we can play something like h5, hoping to activate the king. You see, it's all about the activity that we can obtain. So let's say you play here, I play king h3, I will play king h4, then both of these pawns are somewhat vulnerable, and suddenly we had this kind of cut and dry position with no counterplay. Now we have counterplay. Now, let's say our opponent decides to completely neutralize this idea. h4 is too annoying, so they play h5 to stop our pawn from advancing. Everything is symmetrical. I'm about to become passive, but I have just enough time to play rook c8, excellent move. And I'm basically giving up the pawn on b2 because I know that after you take, I can also take the pawn on g6. You see, that was the whole point. I played h4 to create counterplay, and then when you neutralize me, you have to play h5, leaving the pawn on g6 vulnerable and allowing white to have counterplay. Now, let's go back a little bit. So we've seen a lot of interesting lines, but let me show you how the game continues. So after king c5, it was actually just b3, kind of holding the pawn, right? But now with black, we can play another clever move, d4. You see, for a while, we've been saying how this pawn is backward and isolated, but now the weakness actually became a strength because black can play d3 and king d4 next. And that's actually winning for black. So let's say with white, I really want to stop this. I'll play rook to d3 to prevent the advance. Let's make more progress with black. Now we can play rook e8. Just maybe we have some ideas, maybe rook e3 or some other invasions. King f3 to neutralize, and I can play a5. a5 is a very simple move, and yet it is nice, it is effective, it is memorable. I want you to pay attention to this move. The idea is I want to play a4 next. So if you play something like h4, I will play a4, breaking your pawn structure. And after these two pawns are traded, the pawn on c4 will be lost. For example, pawn takes, king takes, you move the rook, I play d3, and the game is basically over. Now, let's come back a little bit. The line that I have here is actually after a5, a4. And then here, well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to win, but here's one clean way to finish the game. It could be, let's say, h5, just to be ready to trade if necessary, or just gain some space. If you play g4, I can also play h4 if I want to. All of this looks nice, to be honest. But anyway, h5, h4, I play rook e4. So I am protecting the pawn. And now white has nothing better than to wait. But this is a desperate waiting position because with the moment that you play a4, you left this hole on b4 that I will use. So I can play king b4, king a3, king b2, and king c2. That's a kind of a beautiful way to end the game because now I play king c2 and the rook on d3 is just hanging. It's just completely lost. So the game is over on the spot. Now, what did we learn from this half of the game? So what we've learned is that, well, I mean, we had some kind of an advantage in the middle game, right? But sometimes you have an advantage in the middle game, suddenly you trade queens, the nature of the game changes, those resources that you had are gone, they are neutralized, and suddenly you go into an ending that's not even safe, right? Here, obviously white made some mistakes, but we had this position that was objectively better for white. We were playing for either win or draw, and somehow we managed to lose the game. Now, let's see how white could have and should have played instead. And let me give you the general rule of thumb that you can follow so you never make this kind of mistake again. The idea is, If you have a safer king, you do not want to trade queens. Doesn't work every single time, but I would say 95% of the cases, it's the right decision to make. Now, some people were thinking, well, what about the backward pawn on d6? It's true. The backward pawn on d6 is a target that we want to focus on. But having queens on the board will make it easier for that idea to work out, will make the defense harder, and you will see why in a moment. And then to address one final point, some people thought trading queens reduces counterplay. That's not really true, right? You cannot think just in terms of like trading pieces reduces counterplay, because the reality is that trading queens is always kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, you are reducing checkmate ideas, but you're also giving the king freedom to move around, right? The king on g8 cannot go around with queens on the board. So by trading queens, you're actually creating a new kind of counterplay, like we saw in the line just now. Okay, enough talking, let's go on. The line that I've written here is actually queen f4. And it's not so much about going to f4 with the queen. What I'm really trying to achieve here is double up against the pawn on d6, having the rook ahead. But for now, I'm just playing a nice looking move, attacking the pawn. Now, let's see a few moves. The reality is that black is kind of stuck, so we have many ways to achieve our objectives. King g7, rook d3, queen d2, then rook d5, why not? And now that we have played rook to d5, this diagonal is blocked, so I can play c4 next. So now let's say king g7, c4, king g8. Now you might be wondering, why is black just waiting? Black is waiting because there is nothing better to do, okay? You can analyze the game a little bit more and try to reach a similar conclusion, but I promise you, there is nothing better to do than to wait. And now here we have an interesting continuation. We can play a4. And a4, I like it because we can play a5 next to try to create a weakness on b6. So let's say king g7, a5. Here I have a threat. The threat is I'm going to take on b6, give a check, and win a pawn. And with a pawn up, I have faith in my chances. Now, let's say you play king f7, getting out of the check. I will trade, and now b3. This is kind of a machine move, to be very honest with you. I got it from the engine, and it is the most accurate. And I'm just going to explain it to you in simple terms. I could have just played b4 and just tried to play c5, but the reason that b3 is like especially accurate is because it leaves black in a sort of a mini Zugzwang where there is really no good way to maintain the position. The king is actually in a great square on f7 because he's ready to go kingside on or center, depending on what we do. Here, with black, you have to choose. So let's say you go a little bit to the right, you go to g8, then I can play b4, and then, well, I mean, that's annoying, right? Because I'm going to play c5 next, and then you don't really have a good way to stop this. And I'm basically going to win the pawn because of the pin. Basically, you don't have time to play king e7, protecting the rook. That's the point. Now, let's try a different line. Let's say you played king e7. So now you're kind of trying to stay close to the rook to neutralize this idea. But now I have a different continuation. I can play queen d4. That's a very nice move. I have two ideas here. I want to take on b6, which would be awesome, pawn up for no risk. And I also want to play maybe queen g7 or queen h8. So now let's say we play rook b7. And here's a moment of making a choice. We actually have pleasant choices. One choice is to play queen g7 check. We are attacking the rook. So the only continuation is queen f7, we trade, and after we take on d6, we are a pawn up, have kind of more space, more activity. We should be better here. Not quite winning, but we are much better, clear advantage at least. But the reality is that the other option is way better. The other option is queen h8. I give it a double exclamation mark just because white refused to take the extra pawn in order to obtain some kind of an overwhelming initiative. So now there's a lot of continuations, but throughout all of these complications, I just want you to remember one thing. The one thing you have to remember is that white is getting all of this play and all of these ideas because they kept queens on the board. If this position was the same pawn structure and the same pieces in the same locations, But without the queens, this would probably just be like some advantage for white. But honestly, not much, right? The king would do an excellent job defending both pawns. The rook would become free. Who knows what will happen? Probably a draw. Now, queen h8. Let's deal with this. The game here could have continued with queen f7, rook d3, and now it's kind of an interesting position, right? What to do? Something that I wanted to tell you is, first, let's imagine that black did nothing. So let's say black just kind of wait. That's not legal in chess, but let's imagine that that was possible. So black waited, did nothing. Now we can play check, king d7, queen a8. So this is very typical, by the way, when we are playing like queen and rook versus queen and rook, or like this kind of heavy pieces in general, is when we try to invade, sometimes we just move around, right? Just go in, go to the other side, bring the rook. One way or another, things end up working out. So for example, here, we are attacking the rook. It's a very simple, very brute force idea, right? But if you play like this, I can play queen b8 and the pawn is lost. Now, let's say you play king c7, then I can play rook e8. I'm threatening mating 1. And now, if you play king d7, no, queen d7, to prevent the mate, I can just play, it's kind of a funny looking move, b4. And this is winning. It's winning because basically white doesn't have a good waiting move. Basically, it is kind of a sux one in the kind of a funniest possible way. For example, if you play king c6, I can play check, and you're going to be forced to give up the queen. Or if you push, maybe I will give a check. And if you cover, I will play rook a8 and then check, and or c5. Who knows? One way or another, I am winning this in a very convincing manner. Now, let's come back. This whole situation is just horrific for black, and I hope that you're kind of beginning to absorb some of that intuition. But now let me show you a different line. Let's say you played b5 instead. Well, after b5, we actually have some nice tactical refutation, just so that you see that waiting loses, but moving also loses. You play b5, I have the clever c5. I'm attacking the pawn and I'm clearing this square. The point is that if you take the pawn, I just give you a check and then a mate. So that's another nice way for the game to end. Now, let's go back. Let's see. There's quite a few things that we could look at, and I recommend that you analyze this position a little bit more, just so that you can really absorb all of the ideas. So for us today, let's just give it one more try. So let's say instead of queen d5, obviously that's a bad move, and instead of the line that I just showed you, let's try queen f4 again. And let's say king g7. Okay, we've seen this before. We already know how it goes. Let's say that our opponent, after a5, decided that pawn takes is just too annoying, so they decided to do pawn takes a5. Now we can play c5. You see, again, exploiting the weakness of this position, the vulnerability of the king, and these kind of tactical opportunities that arise. So we play c5. This is almost a brute force approach, right? This would never work if queens were not on the board, because probably the king would be like on e7 by now, and this would be neutralized extremely easily. It would be a dead draw. With queens, different story. So now king f7. I could take, to be honest. It would be nice. But you know what's even nicer? c6. Because after c6, I basically, you see, if I take, I'm kind of blocking my forces, right? It's like I'm doing great, probably winning. But my rook and my queen are a little bit slow to join the game. But instead, if I push, then after you move the rook, I push again, attacking the rook. And when you go away to c8, I can take on d6. So now this is just a full invasion, right? So I have the perfect combination between active queen, active rook, vulnerable king, and a passed pawn on c7 that acts as an amazing decoy. So here the game could have been over after, let's say, queen e5, rook d5. I'm kind of inviting you to take, right? But because if you take, I'm just going to give you a check, and I'm going to win the queen. So let's say you play queen e6, I can give another check. You have a choice, right? If you go forward, I'm going to give you a check, right? This is easy, right? Check, and then rook d6, and I win the queen. And then if you go away to g8, I can just play queen d4. And I'm going to give a checkmate on g7 next. So this concludes our analysis of this example. Now, I hope that as you reviewed this game, you were able to grasp the key ideas, but I want to go back and kind of give you a quick recap so that we can be sure that you understood the key points. Let's go back to the initial position. The dilemma here was whether to trade or not. And the simple rule of thumb is black has played f5, their king is exposed. There are diagonals, open squares all around the king, so their king is significantly more exposed than mine. My king is safer. There is also a vulnerability on d6. Now, a single weakness may not win, but when we combine pressure against the pawn on d6 with other ideas, like tactical shots against the king, then we can have a decisive advantage. Now, on the other hand, if we trade queens, we'll make it easy for the king to join the game, act as an excellent defender, and we might end up losing instead. Thanks for watching. This channel is all about helping you learn and grow at chess. Hit like, subscribe, and join our Discord. It's full of learners just like you who are discussing openings, puzzles, and new video ideas.